So far, so good. Good evening. It is good to see everyone this evening. Before we get into our lesson, I do want to make one more quick addition to what was mentioned about August 7th. I think we said this morning as well. It'll just be a couple hours on a Monday before school starts that we'll have some activities for the kids, do some Legos in relation to a Bible lesson and stuff like that. There are some books on the back table over on this side. If you want to take a look at those, what we decided to do is instead of giving backpacks to the kids like we did last year, we're going to give them these books. They are books from the Institute of Creation Research that they put out, really good books, kind of relating science to the wonder of creation and connecting that to God and everything. They're made for kids, so very well designed and so forth. So we are going to try and give one of those out to each kid. If you want to take a look at what they are, we are asking, as we did last year, for backpacks to be donated, asking for donations towards those books. So see me your list if you want to donate to that effort to provide those books for the kids. I'm sure that we are all, as I look around the room, pretty familiar with the Sermon on the Mount. Most of us, I think, have probably read that many times, in fact, and we have internalized, at least in terms of memorization and so forth, a lot of the statements, a lot of the commands, a lot of the reminders that Jesus gives in the Sermon on the Mount. Perhaps one of the common ones that you've heard: you are the salt of the earth, you are the light of the world. In other words, you are supposed to be an influence, you're supposed to shine, your example is supposed to penetrate of the darkest corners of the world that is lost in sin. But there's also another statement that's given. If we look over in Matthew chapter 6, we have, beware practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. And Jesus proceeds from there to talk about the Pharisees, especially, and how often they would do the things that were considered righteous deeds, although some of them were actually just things that the Pharisees made up. But nonetheless, righteous deeds were being performed, but it was only for the sake of people seeing that. But wait a minute, we just said in chapter 5, we want people to see our righteousness. Now, we probably have isolated those two things in a sense in our minds, right? Understanding, yes, one clearly has wrong motives and the other one doesn't. But nonetheless, I don't know that we often recognize how to establish when we're going to one side or the other. When are we, by doing what we should be doing as Christians, shining our light, and when are we, for lack of a better term, flaunting our righteousness? Because I would argue, and maybe this has happened to you, it's happened to me, sometimes I kind of feel conflicted when I have a decision to make, because I don't want to come off like I'm just, oh, look at what I'm doing. But I also want, if I'm doing something good, to be a good example to others. I don't want to hide that in the sense that I want to let my light shine. So how do we balance those two things? How do we shine without flaunting, if you will? In order to answer that for just a few minutes this evening, let's consider some questions to ask ourselves as we are making these decisions, as we are deciding how we're going to behave, trying to act in a righteous way. Let's think about some questions that we should be mulling over in our minds in order to help us not go to the extreme of flaunting our righteousness, but on the other hand, not hiding our light. Because honestly, if we're too afraid of flaunting our righteousness, we might not let our light shine. Or if we are, on the other hand, if we are trying to let our light shine, but we are beginning to like the attention that can sometimes bring, we can end up shining our light, but really it becomes about us and not about others. So the first question we want to consider then: when I make a decision to act in a righteous way, and I'm trying to decide if this is something that is going to be a more public type thing, or something that I'm going to try and, for lack of a better term, not put out there, if you will, not make known, I need to ask, what is my goal? What is my goal? In the Revolutionary War, this is something I didn't realize until fairly recently. The Revolutionary War, there was a point I believe it was right before Saratoga, which was considered by many a major turning point in the Revolutionary War, there was a strategy concocted by the British. There were two generals. There was one kind of in the north, and mid-north, I guess you could say, if you're looking at a map of the 13 colonies. And there was one in the south, kind of near Philadelphia. So General Burgoyne is in the north. General Howe, I believe it's Howe, yeah, is in the south. And they had concocted this plan. Basically what they were going to do is they were both going to march towards each other and split the colonies in half, cut off their supply lines, isolate the two halves, and hopefully that would allow them to win a victory against the American colonists. And so General Burgoyne in the north, he starts marching down and he starts encountering some resistance. It's going okay. The plan seems to be going like it should be, but he starts encountering some resistance. And so he sends word to General Howe, hey, if you hurry up and pull your part of the deal, then we can make this work. Well, General Howe, he has a different idea. Instead of following the plan, he decides, I have a chance for some personal glory. And so he takes the capital then, Philadelphia, and takes that city from the colonists. Of course, that ends up leaving General Burgoyne by himself, and the colonists are able to inflict a major defeat on the British and eventually win the war. He won a victory. Howe won a victory by taking Philadelphia, but he forgot the actual goal of the entire thing. The goal is not to win a battle. The goal is to win the war. In the same way, when we're making a decision, we need to figure out, what is my actual goal when I'm doing this? Is my goal in every decision I'm making to try and, number one, serve God myself, but number two, genuinely help others to see God, to know more about God, to understand more of who God is? Or is my goal something else? I mean, we have, again, throughout Matthew, several mentions of those who would do all these things that were considered good, but they would do them to be seen by men. He says this again in Matthew chapter 23 and verse 5, as he's going through this list of all the errors that the Pharisees have fallen into. He says, you're doing these things to be seen by men, not because you're actually trying to accomplish what supposedly this deed would accomplish. It reminds me of in James chapter 2, verses 15 and 16, when James is describing faith and works and how they work together. He says, if a brother or sister comes to you and they say, I'm hungry, I'm without, I have need, and you say to that brother, that sister, yes, be warmed and filled, and send them on their way and don't actually give them anything to help them, it doesn't accomplish anything. In other words, you can sound all helpful, all good, oh, look at me, I'm acknowledging this problem, in our vernacular perhaps, oh, I'll pray for you, right? And then we leave it at that. And we don't actually try and help, but it seems like we're being a good person. We're acknowledging this fact. We're offering some kind of something, but what's the goal? Is our goal actually to help the person, or is our goal to fulfill the minimum requirement of, oh, I'm a Christian, I guess I should, oh, sorry, and then move on with our lives? In Luke chapter 6 and verses 32 through 35, we have this similar idea where Jesus says, you do realize that if you love the people who love you, that's not anything. If you love the people who love you, you're just doing what literally everyone does. The worst of the worst like the people who like them. Now they like the people who like them because they're selfish, but that's kind of the point. What's the goal? If my goal when I'm loving someone is, well, I know that they love me, so it's going to be a mutually beneficial thing, well, I think I've lost sight of the goal of love as God described it, haven't I? What is my goal? Because if my goal is anything other than I want to genuinely help this person, show the love of Christ to that person, my goal is anything else, especially anything related to what I can gain, all of a sudden, no matter how good of a thing I might be doing, I've lost sight of the purpose of it. So if I want to shine as a light rather than just putting my righteousness out there for my own benefit, I have to make sure I know what I'm actually trying to accomplish. I must do good works to bring glory. I must not do good works, rather, to bring glory to me, but to God. I must not do good works to bring glory to me, but to God. And that can be hard because sometimes we want encouragement when we're doing something right. It's not wrong to be thankful, to be grateful when people encourage you when you're doing something right. But that can't ever be our motivation. Something they always told us in preaching school that I really appreciate. Don't believe your own press clippings, right? Don't believe what other people say about you, because it's not that the encouragement's bad. It's not that when someone says, oh, good lesson, preacher. Oh, how dare you say that, right? No, I appreciate the encouragement. It's not that I resent the encouragement. It's that I don't ever want those kinds of encouragements to be why I do what I do. And that's the same for all of us. There are a whole variety of ways where we can gain from what actually God is calling us to do selflessly. Which leads us to our next question. The goal, right, is the central focus of all of this. But again, sometimes my goal genuinely, I can at least see how this is genuinely helping someone else, genuinely showing the love of God to someone else. There's something else to consider. Which actions need to be seen? Which actions, what things that I do need to be seen? And the reason I say that is because sometimes there are times where something we do needs to be very public. Because the incident we're responding to or the decision we're making is in a public context. For example, if someone, I think about the apostles in the New Testament, right? In the book of Acts. If someone is speaking against our Lord, well, depending on the situation, that's probably a situation where I want to stand up and say, no, this is the truth. And we need to contend earnestly for the faith. There are other times where, as Jesus also says, my right hand doesn't need to know what my left hand is doing. I know this is my left hand, this is my right hand. I've always been dyslexic, so it's okay. But it depends on what we're talking about as to when something needs to be seen or not be seen. This is not speaking of anyone here or related to anyone here at all. But I have seen instances with Christians where, for example, they'll post something on social media about some good work they've been doing. And I don't at all dispute that the work is a good work. But at the very least, and I don't know their hearts, and I have no need to know their hearts, but at the very least, sometimes the way those kind of things are presented can come off like, look at what I'm doing. Now, sometimes, let's think about a missionary who's sent overseas, and they've accomplished a great deal for the Lord's work. They're going to come back and present to the supporting congregation. Well, they're presenting to the people who are helping them to encourage. Again, the goal is to encourage. There's a big difference between that and trying to put the spotlight on ourselves. What actions need to be seen? In Mark chapter 8 and verse 38, remember, Jesus makes it clear we can't back down if we need to make something public, if we need to make something be seen. If someone puts us in front of a TV camera, broadcast across the whole world, surely you've given up in believing in God by now, right? I mean, everyone agrees that God is dead, right? Well, that's a time where very publicly we all need to be willing to say, no, I believe that God exists. I believe that God has proven himself. And I believe that most people are deceived. Those are times where we need to show we are not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. In Luke chapter 23 and verse 34, Jesus is on the cross. A very public type of execution. That's the purpose of a cross. Well, two purposes, right? The first purpose of crucifixion is to inflict as much torment on the person being crucified as possible. But the second, equally valid, or not valid, equally intended, we should say, purpose of crucifixion is to warn everyone who's watching, to make a very public example. This is what happens if you cross the Romans. So in a very public setting, what does Jesus say? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Now you could try and argue, it would look pretty pitiful if you tried, but you could try and argue Jesus is just saying that to look good. Jesus is just saying that to take the high road. No, Jesus is saying that because he is in a public situation. This is a chance to make a statement about what he came to do, why he's up there in the first place. I know I've brought it before, but it reminds me of the case a few years ago now with Botham Jean, I believe I'm saying his name correctly, the shooting and everything that happened, and his brother voluntarily asking the judge if he can go to his brother's killer and give her a hug and say, I forgive you. Now I know, because he's made statements after that he was conflicted about doing that, in part because he didn't want to seem like he's drawing the spotlight to himself. But that was an opportunity, and I would argue it was a very wonderful opportunity for a brother in Christ on a public stage in a public setting, because the entire thing was very public, to show how a Christian should respond. Which actions need to be seen? We never need to back down when we have an opportunity with the right goal, with the right focus, to show people the love, to show people the message, to show people the goodness of our God. But again, it can also be very tempting to make things known that don't need to be known. Think of Ananias and Sapphira. Why did they lie about the amount of money that they sold that property for? Even Paul, or rather Peter, points out there would have been nothing wrong with them keeping some back. They wanted to say it was the whole sum because they wanted to look good. Everyone else was selling their property and giving all the proceeds, so they want to look just as good as everyone else. And so they made it more public than it needed to be, because for them it wasn't about the giving, it was about the appearance. And we know what happened after that. There's a show that Melissa and I watched, and at one point, one of the characters, he's kind of made everyone mad at him, and trying to defuse the situation, he says, look, I didn't want to make a big deal about this, but I have donated a sizable amount of money to this charity over here. And everyone's just staring at him like, this has nothing to do with anything that's going on. Literally all you're doing is trying to deflect what everyone's mad at you about to make yourself look good by saying, I donated to this charity. Now, it's an extreme example. But that's where we have to be honest with ourselves. Some choices are naturally visible. Others are only visible if I make them visible. And I would argue that's the difference we see with Jesus, with the apostles. They visibly, very openly stood for Christ, stood for the gospel message when the situation called for it and it was appropriate. But even Paul, in many of his letters, stresses the point, I did not ever make any of this about myself. I never tried to take the spotlight. I never said, oh yes, you need to say you are of Paul. No, he said, don't say I am of Paul, I am of Apollos, I am of Cephas, because it's not about any of us. Some things are only visible if I make them visible. And often I really don't need to. But thirdly, not only do I need to think about what my goal truly is, what actions actually need to be seen, and what actions I just need to do the will of God, and if someone finds out, whatever, but I don't need to bring attention to it. But thirdly, and this is really getting to the heart of why I make the choice I make. Who approves of my actions? Who approves of my actions? Again, using an example from a TV show. There's a point at which, in this office setting, one of the employees finds a list that the manager has written. And the list has two columns. There's names on one side, and there's names in the other. And they're trying to figure out what does this list mean? What does it mean to be on the right side of the list or the left side of the list? And it becomes pretty clear the people on the right side of the list are the people the boss likes, and the people on the left side of the list, rather, the people on the right side of the list are people that the boss doesn't like. And so, in an effort to try and convince themselves that that's not actually what it means, one of the people who is on the right side of the list, the bad side, she's getting all upset, and the others are like, look around, does this look like a group of losers? And she looks around, and very clearly they are a group of losers, and she just starts sobbing because she's super upset, right? And it's meant to be funny, it's not meant to be sad. But when we think about that in context, do I want to be getting the approval of the people who are going to be looking for the surface level actions? Or am I trying to, hey, if people who genuinely want to encourage me because they see me doing my best to do God's will, if they want to encourage me in that, that's wonderful. But that's the only kind of encouragement I want, and I'm not going to ask for it. I'm not going to bait people to give it to me. Because a lot of times what ends up happening is when we are trying to get the approval, when we are trying to make it about us, we end up getting approval of all the wrong people. In Luke chapter 6 and verse 26, Jesus says what I think we could argue is kind of a harsh statement. Woe to you when all people speak well of you. It'd be kind of nice if everyone liked me, right? Isn't that a good thing? No, he says it's a bad thing. Because the world, as a general rule, Jesus says elsewhere, they don't like people who are not of the world. We may be in the world, but we're not to be of the world. If we were of the world, Jesus says in John 15:19, the world would love itself, but we're not of the world. And yet, when we start trying to shine the spotlight on ourselves, ironically, whether they realize it or not, people who are also in it for themselves tend to recognize fellow self-centered people. And so we'll get praise, all right. We'll get praise for all the wrong reasons. Paul said in Galatians chapter 1, am I trying to seek the approval of God or of men? He says, clearly, if I were seeking the approval of men, I wouldn't be in the position I am doing what I'm doing. I only want the approval of God. That is the goal. Righteousness is rarely popular. So if I'm popular, I'm probably in it for me. Again, not to discount or discourage the encouragement that we are supposed to show to one another. Barnabas is a clear example, a very much positive example of encouragement among brethren as we're doing what God wants us to do. But the allure of the spotlight is not something we as Christians are immune to. So, as we conclude this evening, I just want us to use these as helpful tools. If I'm going to be honest, I'm going to be completely honest, I think most of us in this room, most of us, shouldn't say us, most of y'all in this room probably fall much more on the, I'm trying to hide everything I'm doing because I don't want to appear like I'm putting myself in the spotlight. And I admire that mindset. Now, there are times where it's good for people to know the good things you do. learned things. I'm not going to put you on the spot, but I've learned things about some of y'all, about how you've given, about how you've been generous in ways you haven't really told anybody, but I've just discovered in one way or another. I admired that. It's a good thing. So I'm not saying this to get on to anyone, but on either side, whether we become hesitant to do things that are genuinely encouraging with the right heart, or whether at times we begin to realize, oh, I'm enjoying the spotlight a little too much. There is a balance to be struck. There's a balance that Jesus himself is teaching here in the Sermon on the Mount. Let your light shine, not so that people can see you ultimately. Let your light shine so people see God. That's what the point is. That's what the goal is. That's the beauty of all of this. You think about it, if I'm a light, I don't know about y'all, but if you've ever tried staring into a light, whether it's a light bulb or the sun or something like that, it doesn't work very well. You want to stare at whatever the light's shining on. We should be shining on God. So people aren't staring at us. They're looking to where we're pointing. If there's anything we can help you with this evening, please let it know. We're always staying ready to help one another as we stand and sing.